morning.
Morning.
I'd like to start by asking your permission for something. Is it okay to ask your permission? See, now I'm going to do it twice. If you don't give me permission, by the way, this is going to be a really short service. I had a message prepared for today. It was going to be the last week of our series, Is God Good? And about Wednesday or Thursday, I was having some conversations with some staff members and just sharing some of what was on my heart, and they were sharing some of what's on their heart. And in the midst of that conversation, it just became clear that we need to do something different this week. And so I typically put a whole lot of work into trying to make a message helpful and as concise as possible and some really thoughtful takeaways and fairly structured, at least in my head. I really haven't had the time to do that with this message as much as I would like. And so I'm going to have to kind of find my way through it. So if it's your first week here, I'm so sorry. But can I have your permission to just kind of like do my best and see how this lands? Is that okay? So, okay. And that's about a quarter of the room. For the other 75%, sorry, we're just going to go forward with it anyway. Actually, I was a few weeks ago, my wife Emily was doing a Peloton workout. It's an exercise bike, and there's an instructor on this screen that tells you what to do. And she was doing the workout with this woman named Robin. Robin will really push you, like really hard on the Peloton workouts. And Robin started this session out by saying, like, okay, you at home, I want you to repeat after me. And so Emily, I'm like in the room, like working at the desk, right? And I hear Emily, like, she raises her hand and she says, I. And Robin says, state your name. She says, Emily Crane, will give this my all. And Emily said, I will try. So it was like, not quite the, right? So, because she doesn't know what she's getting herself into, and you don't know what you're getting yourself into by giving me permission. And I'm sorry about that, but we're going to walk through it. In late 2008, some of you will remember, we started entering into a national financial collapse. And as we got toward the end of 2008 and into 2009 and into 2010, we began to become more aware of why it was that we had such a housing bubble that had popped. And what we discovered is that a lot of financial institutions and a lot of people who were investors had made really big bets that were incredibly risky for average, ordinary people in order to try and amass as much wealth for themselves as possible. And I remember during that time when it started to trickle out, like why this had happened, it was just stunning how irresponsible some of the people who had been, very successful, very high up in some of these firms had been, and how they had really gambled all of our collective wealth in order for them to make some dollars. And I remember during that time, I had the feeling, I'm sure many of you had the feeling like, man, these folks are just trying to like sidestep this repeatedly, and nobody will own up to it. No one will confess, and no one will just like be honest about, yeah, this is really terrible. This shouldn't have happened. We shouldn't do it again. There are regulators who are trying to like figure out ways to work it out, but there's no like owning of the problem. And I just remember finding that incredibly, incredibly frustrating. And I've watched over the last 2.5 years, just like you have, as we've seen, for me, some of the most turmoil that's ever existed in my lifetime, right? Global, worldwide turmoil. We've had a global pandemic, something we hadn't experienced since the early 20th century. We've had in the U.S. like political and racial unrest. We've had worldwide problems with inflation. We've seen a war break out between Russia and Ukraine. We've been a part of that. And just over the last couple of weeks, we've had an immense amount of just heartache as a nation as we saw 10 people shot and killed in Buffalo, New York, just doing their grocery shopping or working in the grocery store because someone had harbored racist thoughts about African Americans in this country and came in and used that in order to wipe them out. And then we just saw 19 children shot and killed in Uvalde, Texas, the state I grew up in. Just this last week. A couple of teachers, one teacher whose husband was so heartbroken, he died of a heart attack just a couple days later. Close to where we are, just a few days ago in Orange County, there was a church shooting where one person died trying to protect the rest of the congregation. You take all that and you start to think, man, if ever there was a time that the world and that our culture has needed the hope that the church is supposed to steward, it is now. Right? The message of the gospel is that Jesus Christ went an infinite distance for us because human beings have infinite worth. God loves us that much. And that out of his love, he paid an ultimate sacrifice for us, that we might reconnect with our life source, that we might live transformed, good, ethical lives, that has good relationship with God and that has good relationship with people. And that we might then one day step into an eternity of grace and love as God rights every wrong and wipes away every tear. That's the message of the gospel, and it's a message of hope and grace and love, and it's a message that essentially gives people hope regardless of circumstances. Like, even if you walk into the hardest things, this is the God who is working to renew, restore, and reconcile all things from an eternal perspective. And the world desperately could have used that from the church over the last 2.5 years. Whether they believed it or not, wanted to join us or not, they could have used it as something in our culture to unite people together instead of dividing them, fracturing them apart like everything else was. Instead, I've noticed, just like you've noticed, that over the last 2.5 years, the church has mostly been known for a couple of other things. One, being compulsively political, with many church leaders so fearful and so driven crazy by the idea of self-preservation that it has turned into full-blown partisan advocacy. That's what it's ballooned into. And two, rampant, hypocritical, immoral behavior. Those are the things that we've been known for in the United States. And so whether you're a Jesus follower or not, if you're in the room or you're watching this, and you've noticed that, and there's been a part of you inside that's just been like, can't someone just own up to that? Can't we just name that the church had a pop quiz over the last 2.5 years and radically failed? Today, I want to own that for you and name that I am heartbroken. I am heartbroken at the power grabbing, the self-preservation, and the immoral behavior of the Christian church in the United States. I'm heartbroken by it. And I want us to spend some time today exploring why the way that the church has behaved over these last 2.5 years is not consistent with the call of Jesus on our lives, and what it is that we, those of us who claim to be followers of Jesus, might be able to do about it. Over the last couple of weeks, I have said this repeatedly. We've talked about what is it that God looks like, because Christians are supposed to be little Christ. They are supposed to be people who align their lives, reorient their lives around the way of Jesus. And so if you have to do that, you have to know what Jesus is actually like. And Jesus shows us what God is like. And so over the last couple of weeks, we've said repeatedly this, that God looks like Jesus, dying on the cross for the sake of his executioners. He loves them so much that even as they are nailing him to the cross, even before that, as they were whipping him, he's on. When they lift him up, one of his last words is, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." And Jesus laid his life down because he taught us something that the world had not conceived of before and struggles to grapple with now, which is that if you actually want to find your life, you have to be willing to lay it down. It was a completely counterintuitive, paradoxical way of seeing the world, but it is the way of God. And Jesus said things like this over and over again in his ministry. In the book of Luke, in chapter number 4, starting with verse number 5, we read this. The devil led him, Jesus, up to a high place, and he showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world. And he said to him, I will give you all their authority and splendor, right? So he leads Jesus up, and he says, look at everything. All the kingdoms, all the power, all the authority. I'll give it to you. You can have it. And if that was Jesus' goal, to just come and assume all the power and the authority over other people, perhaps he would have taken him up on the deal. The devil continues, it has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours. By the way, interesting thing this, Jesus doesn't refute the devil's claim here. The devil says he has a foothold in every single earthly kingdom, that he has some amount of authority and power over it, and that it's his to give away and to use as he chooses, which means we, as followers of Jesus, should always be suspicious of every kingdom of this earth, whatever kingdom it is, and some of the power that is inherent in it and some of the power that is behind it. There is no such thing as a Christian nation. Those two things just are different. Christians, by their very nature, are transnational. Like, their allegiance is first and foremost to Jesus Christ. It is not first and foremost to a particular nation or to a particular political party or to a particular sports team. First and foremost, their allegiance is to Jesus Christ. And so you cannot have a group of people who are transnational and carry passports only because they have to. They still exist in this earth, but they are not of it. You cannot have that turned into a nation, because nations have borders and nations have boundaries and nations work to protect and defend and to spread the boundaries. And Jesus instead lays his life down in order that more people might enter in to the kingdom of God. It's all been given to me. And if you worship me, it'll all be yours. Jesus replies to him. It's written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. In other words, no deal. We're not doing that. But we see this kind of refusal to just have power over repeatedly. In fact, Jesus is talking to Pontius Pilate after he's arrested. And Pilate has heard that Jesus is the king of the Jews. He was like, well, that's interesting, because that doesn't mean anything in Rome. And so he asked him, are you a king? Is it true what they say? And Jesus asked him, like, is that your own idea that I'm a king, or did you get that from somewhere else? He was like, I got it from somewhere else. Jesus replies to him, and he says this in John 1:18. Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. In other words, I'm not denying that I'm a king. But my kingdom's not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. Why? Because kingdoms of this world use power in order to hold on to power. Kingdoms of this world use power over other people in order to expand their borders. He says, I am a king, it's true, but my kingdom's not of this world. If it were of this world, we would fight, because that's what kingdoms of this world do. Kingdoms of this world use power over in order to assure that there is peace, and they pass laws and legislation in order to regulate behavior and to regulate all kinds of things. Jesus is saying that's actually not the kind of kingdom that I am a king of. Now, in the United States, it's not legal for you to come physically assault me in the lobby, no matter what I say in this sermon. That's not legal. So if you step out here and you have the idea that, like, I really hated that thing he said, I think I'm going to punch him in the face now, that would be illegal, and you could potentially get into legal trouble if you do that. Now, the United States and this state, this kind of, we have laws on the books about that because we think society is better when people don't go around physically assaulting other people. So they've chosen to pass that law. But society as a whole, our legal structure, really doesn't care why you choose not to assault someone else. Perhaps you don't assault other people because you're just a good moral person. You would just never do that. You know, perhaps you don't assault people because someone assaulted you one time and you just can't imagine inflicting the kind of harm that you received. Perhaps you don't assault people because you just don't want to spend time in jail or you don't want to get arrested. And the state really doesn't care what your reasoning is. They just don't want you to assault people. Jesus is saying, what I'm after here is not state power that only is concerned with behavior. I'm concerned with the heart. And power over others can alter their behavior. They may not do something they would have done otherwise if they might get in trouble, but that doesn't change their heart. That doesn't make them want to do otherwise necessarily in their heart. So my kingdom, it's not of this world. It's not a power over kingdom. If my kingdom were of this world, see, my servants, they would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, because that's what kingdoms of this world do. He goes on in Matthew chapter 20. And he's talking to his disciples, and he says this to them. Jesus called them together, and he said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them, right? What? That's what kingdoms of this world do. Of course they know this. In fact, the Jews would have known this better than most people, because at this point, they are in a land that they used to rule that is now ruled by Rome, and the Gentiles who now rule over them absolutely lord their power over them, and they overtax them, and they basically, if a Roman soldier has a really heavy pack. They have these packs that often weigh between 50 and 70 pounds. They were allowed by Roman law to get anybody to carry that pack for them for about a mile. So they would just go around and ask them to do that, and they had to do it. They were compelled to by Roman law. Why? They had authority over them, and they exercised it. Of course, his disciples knew what it was like for someone to exercise power over them and to alter their behavior. Jesus goes on. Not so with you. In other words, the way that they've behaved, it's not the way you're supposed to behave. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Over and over and over, we see the major difference between the ways of the kingdom of God and the ways of the kingdom of the world as lived out and explicitly taught by Jesus. Pastor, theologian Tim Keller says it like this: the heart of the gospel is the cross, and the cross is all about giving up power. So if this is the case, why is it that Christians in this country over the last couple of years have been increasingly known for pursuing power and trying to get their elected officials in and trying to pass legislation and making sure they're all? Why is that? Well, it's very simple. We do not trust in the power of giving up power. We just don't believe it. Jesus lived it. Yeah, we don't believe it. Jesus taught it. Yep, we don't believe it. It's too counterintuitive. It's too paradoxical. We don't believe it. The first people to hear his message didn't believe it either. In fact, they had a long history of seeing that power over others is something you definitely wanted to obtain, because if somebody had it over you, your life could be pretty miserable. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, start off with the book of Genesis, but the very next book after that is the book of Exodus, and in that is the story of the Israelites. They're a people that's many 100,000 strong at this point, and they're living in Egypt, and they are living as slaves. And the story starts off really with the slavery and it getting worse and worse, and finally God using a man named Moses to come and lead his people out of slavery in Egypt by saying, "Let my people go," in a really cool American accent. You see, the Israelites believed their problem was political. It was Egyptian rulers. That was the problem. Like we're God's chosen people, and if we could just get out of here and govern ourselves, then finally we would be able to be a blessing to the whole world. The whole world could know our God. If we could just overcome this political problem. The wrong people are in charge. It's the Egyptians that are the problem. And they did finally get to leave Egypt, and they went out into the desert, and God gave them a new land and a new place, and they did start a very powerful kingdom, one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world for a season. And yet they kept breaking their covenant with God. God said, "I'll protect you as long as you remain in covenant with me," and they kept disobeying to where finally God took a step back, removed his hand of protection, and there were a number of invading armies that were happy to sweep in and take their land from them when that happened. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Medes, the Greeks, the Romans. After a while, all of the Israelites had their land invaded by all of these people. And suddenly they find themselves in the first century, in Jesus' day and age. And Rome is now in charge, and they're occupying our land. And once again, we feel like we're in slavery or in bondage, or the boot, at least, of our opponent is on our neck. We are not self-governing. How are we supposed to be a blessing to the world around us if we don't have the power over others to introduce them to God? You see, by the time Jesus comes around in the first century, the Israelites believed their problem was political. It was Roman rulers. So what they were looking for was a savior, a Messiah, someone to come and get them out of this horrible predicament that they've been in. Like, if we could just have God send us someone to give us salvation from the Romans, that would be great. And so Jesus comes, and his first followers see him do miraculous things, and they think this must be the Messiah that the prophets promised us. This must be the political ruler that finally is going to overthrow Caesar and overthrow the Roman Empire. They were so excited. In fact, it's a minority view, but there are even some scholars who believe that when Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus, he did so because he believed Jesus was the Messiah, and he did so in order to force Jesus' hand to finally overthrow the Roman Empire, just like Judas always suspected he would. It's a minority view, but what's a majority view is that these disciples thought that Jesus was going to rule a kingdom of this earth, and displace Rome. That's what they thought he was there for. They were stoked for it. In fact, shortly before he's arrested, tried, and crucified, they're arguing over who's going to sit at his right and who's going to sit on his left when he comes into his kingdom. They're not thinking like way down the road, thousands and thousands of years later, when God has like righted all the wrongs and reconciled and renew all things. They're thinking like maybe next Thursday he like kicks the emperor out and we're all just like here. And then one of us has to be top dog, right? Might as well be me. Hey, mom, can you come? Actually, some of the disciples, their mom came in and lobbied for them. How embarrassing. Because the Israelites believed their problem was political. It was Roman rulers. It's why the disciples did not believe Jesus when he told them he was going to be killed. It's why they couldn't possibly understand him when he said, tear this temple down, and in 3 days it will rise again. No. Dead people don't overthrow empires. If you're the Messiah, you're not going anywhere. We can't wait for the action to start. But see, what Jesus taught them was that what was holding the world captive wasn't a geopolitical ruler, and that it wasn't an opponent that could be defeated with political or military might. What was keeping people captive was the sin, the brokenness, the selfishness of the world. And while it was exhibited plenty in empires like Rome and like Egypt and like any earthly kingdom you can imagine right now, at the center of it was not any particular geopolitical empire, but sin and darkness itself. And that unless the Messiah saved us from the actual thing that was binding us, just breaking the chains of any specific empire wouldn't go far enough. So Jesus is killed, and he raises from the dead. And in doing so, he defeats sin and death and the evil forces of this world. That's why later on, one of the first disciples, the Apostle Paul, can say that our battle, our struggle, our wrestle is not against flesh and blood. It's against the powers and principalities and authorities of the spiritual realm. That's what Jesus broke down. That's what we have access through prayer and the Holy Spirit to start to pick apart. That's what the church is supposed to be working against. Your battle is not political. It's spiritual. That's where the power is. And yet, we find ourselves 2,000 years later. Many 21st century American Christians believe their problem is political. It's American rulers. Our problem is we just don't have the right people in office. If we could just vote the right people in and pass the right policies, then finally we'd be a shining city on a hill, a phrase reserved for the church and not ever for a nation. If we could just get the right leaders in, then finally we get it. If we could just make sure we endorse the right candidates, then finally we get it. Just as a reminder, many of you may know this, Christians have tried to get political power since at least the 4th century in the age of Constantine. And historically, every single time that Christians have been able to grab the authority of the state, they have ceased to look like Christians. They have ceased to live like Jesus every single time. In fact, you can go all around the world and see where Christianity was once the dominant political authority, and you will see that Christianity is almost non-existent there from now on. Like every European country just about that you can imagine, the reason there are so few Christians over there, I think a big part of it is because the church got in bed with the state, and what they created together was a bastardized version of the way of Jesus. But we think, no, they just didn't do it right. We would do it right. We're smart. We have the internet. Like they didn't do it right, but we would do it right. There was this show a few years ago called Arrested Development, one of the greatest shows ever created. Yeah, okay, I'm not getting near as much positive feedback as I did first hour. That's okay, it's okay. In the first season, there's this married couple that they're having an issue, and he's actually a marriage and family therapist, and so they're trying to figure out if they can salvage the marriage. And he says something like, well, maybe we should just try having an open marriage for a while. And she says, does that ever work? He says, no, that never works. He's like people try to talk themselves into it or something, but it never works. And then he pauses and shakes his head and says, but maybe it'll work for us. It's like this idea that like, no. Every historical example that we have of Christianity grabbing the state authority and power, it ceases to look like Jesus dying on the cross for his executioners. It ceases to look like the gospel, but maybe it'll work for us. Maybe we're the exception. Maybe we have finally figured it out. And this thought just kind of seeps into our mind, and then it can start to distort our entire gospel-oriented view of the world. C.S. Lewis wrote a book decades and decades ago, around the time of World War II, called The Screwtape Letters. Just by show of hands, how many of you read The Screwtape Letters before? Okay, 14 of us, cool. So The Screwtape Letters is a fascinating book because it's written from an older demon to his nephew demon to give him tips on how to help the new Christian that his nephew demon is following around, to try to keep him from being a fervent follower of Jesus. Like, what can I do to make his faith diminish? I mean, that at least sounds like an interesting premise, right? So he's like giving him tips. Here's one of the things that he writes. This is decades and decades ago. This is the time, by the way, of World War II. In the UK, the conversation was, are we going to enter into this war, or are we going to be pacifists, right? Are we going to say, like, oh, we're going to jump into it, we're going to do it, we're going to send all our tanks, or are we going to say, like, this is not our war, this is not our fight, we're going to stay out of it? That was the political disagreement. Fascinatingly enough, C.S. Lewis is going to point to that disagreement without taking a side as to which one is right, because that's not the point. So this is what the older demon says to the younger demon, which sounds like a great start to a joke, but this is just the book, all right? See, so he says this: let your patient begin by treating patriotism or pacifism as part of his religion. In other words, all right, he's a follower of Jesus now. He's a Christian. So then, now that he's a Christian, let him determine, like, which one his faith leads him to, either patriotism or pacifism, right? He'll use his faith to justify whichever position he lands on. Doesn't matter which one, by the way. Then let him, under the influence of partisan spirit, come to regard it as the most important part, right? So it starts as a part of his religion, then it transitions to the most important part, then quietly and gradually nurse him on to the stage at which the religion becomes merely part of the cause. Now, it was just a part, and then it's become like more than that. It's come to regard as the most important part. Now it's just a part of the cause. It's just a part of the religion, in which Christianity is valued chiefly because of the excellent arguments it can produce in favor of the British war effort or of pacifism. In other words, the way to use this political quagmire, this two-party system, is to, like, in order to disrupt his faith, is to have him choose one or the other on the basis of his faith. Doesn't really matter which one. And then suddenly that becomes basically a part of his faith. And then after that, it becomes the most important part of his faith. And then after that, it becomes more important than his faith. And the reason his faith is important is mostly because it makes excellent arguments for whichever political position he's chosen. Are you with me? Now, obviously this was decades ago. This would never happen now. But this is the way it can go. Christians have never, in 2,000 years of church history, agreed on the best way that the state should govern. Ever. So why is the pursuit of political power something we keep running after? Why are we convinced that it's the answer? Russell Moore says this: someone with an unhealthy craving for controversy can always convince himself that he's a warrior for Christ instead of a captive to his passions. Like, over and over and over again, I see Christian leaders who are captive to their passions, wrapping their passions in the cross of Christ and calling it Christian. But there's nothing Christ-like about those passions. It doesn't exhibit the fruit of the Spirit, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This is from John David Kuo, who was a deputy director in George W. Bush's Faith Initiative office. So it was his job to bring pastors and religious leaders to Washington, D.C., and to try and get their vote or their agreement or them to push whatever platform the office of the president was pushing. Now, I don't blame politicians for doing that. They're trying to win. And to them, pastors were another group that they could leverage to get their political platforms to go forward. Of course, kingdoms of the world will do that. That's what kingdoms of the world do. But John was a Christian who was a part of this initiative and saw the dark side of it over time, and eventually left his post there and decided that he had had enough and he couldn't do it anymore. This is what he writes in a book that he released a number of years ago. He passed away of cancer, I think in 2007 or 2006. So, I mean, this is around 2004, I believe, when he wrote this. And he says this: "I have seen what happens when well-meaning Christians are seduced into thinking deliverance can come from the Oval Office, a Supreme Court chamber, or the floor of the United States Congress. They are easily manipulated by politicians who use them for their votes, seduced by trinkets of power, and tempted to turn a mission field politics into a battlefield." I actually heard another advisor who wanted to be anonymous. So they weren't on the podcast, but I was listening to a podcast a few weeks ago, and someone was quoting a conversation that they'd had with them, because this person will not say this publicly. But they also worked for the George W. Bush administration in the same office. And they said in their experience of all the interest groups that they brought in over the course of that presidency in order to try and get them to agree, get them to do votes, get them to push their platform, pastors and religious leaders were the most easily persuaded and the most in awe by having access to the power in Washington, D.C. Why? Why? Because we do not trust in the power of giving up power. We don't trust it. Too paradoxical. We don't trust it. And therefore, the result, we forfeited our group distinctive to become an interest group. That's the result. We've taken this giant cosmic message of the cross of Christ, this message that says, like, God is not done with you. And whatever mess you've walked through, whatever disaster you've seen, whatever suffering you've had to wade yourself through, like, Jesus Christ has come and given his life that the whole world can be renewed, reconciled, that we can be made alive once more, that for everyone who will follow after him, like, your eternity is with a loving God who will right every wrong and wipe away every tear, and that the whole world is being transformed because of this act in history. And we've taken this giant, large, cosmic message and we boiled it down to, therefore, make sure you vote for this person this election season. Well, that feels rather insignificant comparatively. So what do I do with the other religious leader that says I have to vote this way this election season? We forfeit our group distinctive to become an interest group. The other thing that we got to talk about is not just the political problem, which we obviously have, but also the character problem, the hypocrisy problem, the ethics problem. Again, I think this stems from the same thing, that we do not trust in the power of giving up power. We don't do it. So what do we do? Why is it that we keep seeing on the news that leader after leader within Christian churches is failing, that charismatic leader after charismatic leader doesn't have any checks and balances within their board or within their congregation, and they just run rampant? Why is it that we just this last week saw a report released about the Southern Baptist Convention? I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, by the way. So a report released about the Southern Baptist Convention's executive committee that showed years and years of lying and covering up and gaslighting to protect abusers of people, like, from facing any consequences for their sexual abuse and sexual assault. We saw the same kind of thing happen in the Catholic Church a number of years ago. And like, you see that kind of stuff and you just want, for crying out loud, can someone just take some responsibility? Can someone step up and say, this is not the way of Jesus and it shouldn't go like this? Jesus taught us that in order to gain your life, you have to lose it. In order to actually find the light, you have to be willing to enter into the darkness. In order to become the greatest, you have to make yourself the least. That's the way of Jesus. But we just keep clinging to power and clinging to self-preservation, clinging to institutions. Well, we got to protect our institutions. You know, if we don't protect our institutions, then we're not going to be able to share the gospel with other people. And we don't want any of this stuff to distract us from the mission we've been called to, which is sharing the gospel. And we forget that the people who we're supposed to share the gospel with are of infinite worth, created infinite value. They are sons and daughters of God. And we are not allowed to trample on them or discard them or see them as an inconvenience because they're getting us off mission. They literally are the mission. That's what they are. And we need some churches that are willing to say that and to own that and to say this is not right and it's horrible and we don't want to be a part of the problem. And it's not that we're perfect and it's not that, but we've got to think about walking toward a solution. See, here's the problem. We have chosen to believe in Jesus instead of to follow Jesus. So much so that half the screen won't even work when I say that. Like, that's the problem. It's just so true. I don't know what's going on there, but it looks amazing. We've chosen to believe in Jesus instead of to follow Jesus. That's what we've chosen. Oh, we believe in him? Yeah. Go Jesus. Thanks for all the stuff, bud. Like, that was sweet. But to follow Jesus actually costs you something. To follow Jesus means to actually live as Jesus lived. Jesus said, "A new command I give you, love others as I have loved you." And honestly, if we would just do that, I know that sounds simple, it's not simple. Loving others as Jesus loved us, Jesus best loved us by laying his life down for us. Jesus best loved us by forsaking the glory of heaven in order to take on flesh and blood and be here. It was the most selfless thing you can imagine. That's how Jesus best loved us. And so if we were to follow after him, if we were to actually follow him, not just believe, but to follow him, how would that change things? One of the first Christians, the Apostle Paul, talked about what that looks like. What is the fruit of someone, right? What is the fruit of a person who is trying to bear out what it is to be like Christ? And he just says it's love, it's joy, it's peace, it's patience, it's kindness, it's goodness, it's faithfulness, it's gentleness, and self-control. That's what the fruit is. And if you want to follow after Jesus, these are the areas of your life where you ought to be paying attention and you ought to be attentive and you ought to be working on, you ought to be working forward. Not as a legalistic list to check off, but because power comes underneath you. It doesn't force you to obey because something bad's going to happen to you. It comes underneath and says, out of love, I believe that you can be more. Out of love, I believe you can more fully live into the person that God has created you to be. You are to be like him. And what does he look like? Well, God looks like Jesus dying on the cross for the sake of his executioners. Oh, if the church would have that attitude. Oh, if the church would have that desire. Oh, if we were known more for our love for our fellow citizens than for our rampant moral hypocrisy or our quest for political power. Unfortunately, the place we find ourselves right now, maybe you feel just as someone said to me this last week. Someone said to me this last week, if I weren't already a Christian, if I hadn't already tasted and seen that the Lord is good, I don't think I would have any interest in what Christians have to say to me right now. And look, if you're not a follower of Jesus, but you happen to tune in today, or maybe you're here because someone brought you, I'm so glad that you're here. We're so grateful that you're here. And I don't actually get to speak for every Christian in the world, but as much as I can, I just want to say, I am terribly sorry and terribly heartbroken that the church has fallen so short of the life of Jesus, of the teachings of Jesus, of the ethics of Jesus. I'm sorry that we have been loud believers and hypocritical followers. We got to do better. We got to do better. So what about the church? What about the church? You know, I grew up going to churches. My dad is an evangelist. I mean, I've been in churches my whole life, and some of you have been too, and some of you, this is very new for you. But growing up, I heard a lot about this concept called revival. Revival. And it's a concept like over history in the United States, when an individual has had a refreshing encounter with God and their life individually has changed and shifted, we've often called that spiritual renewal. That's a renewal of an individual person who is now, like maybe they had an experience with God before, but now they've really turned their life toward God. But when a whole group of people, sometimes an entire region, has a renewal of God, it's not just individual spiritual renewal anymore. We've called that revival. Revival, like a whole group of people are having this experience, a fresh take, a fresh understanding of who God is. And then when a whole state or a huge swath of the country experiences revival, it now moves not just from revival, but to something called awakening. There's an awakening that's happening in the lives of other people. In my entire childhood, I used to go to literally big tent revivals. They were tent revivals that happened in parking lots. I would hear people say that they wanted revival, and with very few exceptions, and there were a few, with very few exceptions, I would see evangelists come in and do some preaching for a few days, and people would get somewhat excited, and the evangelist would leave, and within a few weeks, that kind of like sputtered out, and it didn't go very far, and it didn't change a whole lot, but it was a good kind of booster or energizer in the middle of the year for a lot of people. I saw that happen a lot. I saw people pray for revival, so they wanted revival. A few months ago, I was in Texas, and I was with another pastor. He's from New York, and we met in Texas, and his name is John Tyson, and a few years ago, a mentor of his had told him that someone needs to do a project to figure out big revivals and awakenings that have happened in the United States. Like, what's the common thread between them? What is it that we see when we see this movements of God break out? What is it that binds those movements together? What does that look like? And so John decided to do some research into that. And the challenge was that these movements of God hadn't just been like contained within one or two denominations. They had happened in all kinds of places, in all kinds of different locales, and with different kinds of Christians. And so this guy who challenged John, he just said to him, the charismatics think that they have a direct access to God because when they come into worship service, right, their hands are up in the air and their hearts are fully open and they're really loud. And so they believe that God has special favor on them and he blesses them and he gives them revival because of how open that they are. But Reformed churches, right, they're like God's frozen chosen. They just stand and like, you want to make sure you don't like move an inch or anything, right? That's their way. But they experience revival too, and they're nothing like the charismatics. And they think God has special favor on them because they take the Bible really seriously, and they've worked really hard on working out their theology, and they've memorized massive passages from John Calvin and Martin Luther, right? Like so God must have special favor on them. But revival breaks out there and in the charismatic circles. And he said, the Anabaptists, they think that God brings revival on them because they are Sermon on the Mount Christians. They really take seriously trying to live out the teachings of Jesus. They refuse to be violent toward one another. They're pacifists. They're turn the other cheek. And they've seen revival and they think, well, God has special favor on us because we're so radically obedient to the teachings of Jesus, the very difficult teachings of Jesus. And certainly they have experienced revival. But in all of these places, tons of differences. God keeps showing up. John, you ought to do a research project on that. Find out what the commonality is because it's not theology and it's not frozen chosen worship and it's not hearts open and hands up. What is it? So John began to do research. And here's what he found. Revival broke out in the places where the people wanted it the most. Revival broke out in the places where people asked for it, but then they lived it, and they experienced individual renewal. And as they began transforming, God began showing up and transforming people around them. In fact, what John showed up is very simple, and it probably ought to be obvious. But after years of looking into it and studying, what he found is God shows up where God is wanted. I'm not convinced that we want God to show up. I am heartbroken as a follower of Jesus because at a time when our nation, our culture needed us the most to have this message of hope and grace and love, we didn't trust in the power of putting down power. We pursued it with everything we had. We were just as scared and fearful as everybody else that we might lose. What if we just forgot about that for a minute and just longed for God to show up? Because we believed that if he would, it would change us and that it would change others. And we might experience spiritual renewal, that they might experience revival, that our nation might even experience an awakening. What would it look like if a couple hundred people got really serious about that? Well, we know what it could look like because we've actually seen it before. It's literally the way the church started in the first century. I'm sorry, this has been a bit scattered and all over the place. I long for God. And I long for you to know him. And I long for you to be aware of his presence, to be changed by him and for him. And there's so much noise right now, and it's so easy to get distracted by the culture. And I just couldn't go another Sunday without laying this out, begging and pleading. So here's what I'm going to ask us to do. Just bow your heads and close your eyes all over the room. Bow your heads, close your eyes. No looking around. We're almost done. I'm not going to ask you to walk forward. I'm certainly not going to try to embarrass you. I'm going to speak for just a moment to those of you who would consider yourself followers of Jesus. So if that's not you at this point, I'm so glad you're here. But if you're not a follower of Jesus, you're not a part of the problem of the church's hypocrisy right now. You're affected by it, but you're not part of it. And so if you could just hang out for a second, that would be great. For those of you who consider yourself followers of Jesus Christ, we just ask you for a moment to search your heart and your mind for just a moment. And just to be really honest with yourself. Do you want God to show up in power? Do you want it more than you want to make sure your kids are at every after-school activity and every soccer activity? Do you want it more than you want to upgrade and buy that new house? Do you want it more than you want that new car? Just be honest with yourself. Like, is that actually a desire of your heart? Is it something that you're pursuing? Is it something that has a hold of you? And here's what I'd ask with every head bowed and every eye closed. If you're feeling a pull, a tug of the Holy Spirit this morning, that it's time to move a step forward in your walk with God, that maybe this desire isn't where it should be for you, but that you want more. I'm going to count to 3 in a few moments, and I just want you to stand and lock eyes with me because I want to pray for you. If you're feeling like, Josh, God is putting this on my heart, that where I'm at right now, I need more of God, and this region needs more of God, and there's just some things that I need to work through, and I know that, and I'd like for you to pray for me. If that's you, I'm going to count to 3 just a moment. I want you to stand immediately and lock eyes with me. 1, 2, 3. And if you're not standing, just keep your head bowed and your eyes closed. People all over this room. I imagine people online. I'm not perfect by any means. I fall short. I need this too. This is not a you thing. This is an us thing. But I just feel like God's got to be calling some of us to take Jesus seriously and to reorient our lives in order to do so, because God shows up where God is wanted. I want to pray for you. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for every person within the sound of my voice, God. I just pray specifically and especially for those who are standing right now, whether they are in this room or maybe they're at home, or maybe they're driving in their car and they decided standing up's a bad idea right now, but in my heart I am. God, would you give us the courage to take our next step of obedience? That's all discipleship is. Will you give us the courage to take whatever our next step of obedience is? God, I suspect that a lot of us, myself included, I suspect our hearts are too hardened to the possibility of revival, renewal, awakening, that we thought like, well, I've never seen it. I don't think it's going to happen. There's so much noise and division all around us. Lord, would you soften our hearts? Help us to see the power of what you might do, even though we've maybe never seen it before. Would you open our eyes, our hearts, to the possibility of it, God? Would you help us to be a part of whatever it is that you want to do in the Chino Valley, in the state of California, in the nation of the United States, in the world. You may be seated. I'm going to ask everybody to look up here for just a moment. If you stood just now, I just need you to know that good intentions don't change anything. They don't change anything. It's not enough to want to take a next step. We have to actually do it. The fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Here's what I'm going to challenge you to do. We're going to sing a song here in just a moment. When we dismiss, as you leave out these doors, you're going to be handed a piece of paper and a pen. And if you stood just now, I would like for you to take your next step, which is to determine which of these do you need to live more into? What of these things does God need to grow you in? Are you a person who needs to have more empathy in your conversations? Are you a person who needs to control their temper better, that the love of Christ might pour out of you? Are you someone who needs to go to someone else and ask for forgiveness? Are you someone who needs to forgive someone else? You realize I've been locking them up for too long in my mind and in my heart, and I did it to punish them, but it's actually punishing me and everybody in my orbit. I have not displayed the forgiveness and kindness of Jesus. I don't know what you are feeling God impress upon you, but my hope is that when we are done here and you leave, one of these things might spark something in you that says, like, you know what? I think my next step of obedience is to do this, is to live into this. And we'd ask you to just write down whatever that is. You can do it anonymously. You don't have to write your name. And then we've got out there just a large wire board that we've put up, and we'd love for you to just attach it. And we want to use this as just a reminder that our church is moving towards something, and that something is Jesus. And we're not perfect, and we never will be, and we will make mistakes, but we're going to keep putting one foot in front of the other, and we're going to keep trying to take our next step of obedience. That's my hope for us. The world desperately needs some of us to share the good news of Christ with them. And regardless of whether that ever wins us anything, we'll at least have been obedient to the one who went an infinite distance for us because he believed we were of infinite worth. Would you stand together with us and worship this morning?